Let's do this.
Awesome. All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Steve Winward. I'm a technical director here at Microsoft Federal. I lead all things Power Platform and Dynamics 365. And with me today,
My name's Craig Harris. So I'm a technical specialist on Steve's team. And if you don't know what a technical specialist is at Microsoft, it basically means I'm kind of like a developer, but mostly I just play one on TV. Right? So beyond that, back to Steve.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So what we're going to talk about today is first, we're going to actually start with some terrible technology predictions. We had a question at the end of this session that kind of teed up what we're about to talk about. So I'm actually kind of cool. We're going to thread that together here. Second, we're going to talk about architecture and security. So we're talking about Power Platform, Dynamics 365, infused with AI. We call that Copilot. And we want to make sure you're incredibly comfortable with what does that architecture look like? What does it mean for Dynamics or Power Platform to talk to a large language model? How does that work? What's the flow look like? We want to make sure you're really comfortable with the security of that. You know that's paramount. And lastly, we're going to show things. We're going to show demos, really cool demos. You're going to see Power Apps in action with Copilot. You're going to see Dynamics customer service with Copilot. And the last demo that Craig's going to show off is an incredible one and such a cool example to show what do you get no code? What do you get low code? How do you kick it up a notch? And you're going to see how progressively the responses get better and better and better. Really, really slick. All right. First terrible technology prediction of today. Whoops, got a little too trigger happy there. I think there is a world market where there's maybe 5 computers. And we all know that's ridiculous today, right? But in 1943, not so much. Why? This is what a computer looked like. That was actually a computer built by Army in 1943. In today's money, it costs millions and millions of dollars. If you walked into that, it would be hard to imagine a space like this, right? The context, that's what they were lacking at the time when they made that assessment. And we talked about that hockey stick curve. This is what the growth of computers have looked like. And that's not even from 1943, that's 1975, right? Accelerated growth. Next, terrible technology prediction. At the time, it was the FCC commissioner in 1961. Basically saying that satellites would never be an effective replacement for communication. We all know that is also not accurate, right? But once again, at that point in time, there were 9 satellites orbiting Earth. What does that look like today? It's kind of crazy, right? It's mind-blowing to me that there's not like a lot more collisions in space. I think, thank God, there's a lot of people that study calculus and understand like the orbital science of this. Because if it wasn't, but we can't live our lives today without that. It's amazing, right? I'm going to pass this one over to Craig.
Okay. So kind of continuing on this theme of really bad predictions as to where technology is going. I think it's easy to see, like if you're looking at the computer and you think, oh gosh, if I'm an investor, I just don't see it. Well, it's just as easy if you're involved in the technical world to not quite understand where something's going. And I think a good example here is with Robert Metcalfe, who again, founder of 3Com, inventor of Ethernet, right? This is a guy who's actually involved in networking. Whenever he looked at the concept of the internet, I predict the internet will soon collapse, spectacularly go supernova, and in 1996 just completely be gone, right? Now, if you're a person like Robert Metcalfe who's involved in technology, this seems like a bit of a miss to have on your byline, don't you think? But if you put it into the context of how he viewed connectivity, right? Especially in the context of someone who's the inventor of Ethernet. Like if you are an 80s or 90s kid like myself and you grew up and you went to LAN parties, right? The good old days of walking around with our PCs, you controlled everything about that environment. You controlled the network. You controlled how people connected to it. You controlled the computer. You had to get your mom to drop you off so you didn't have to lug it down the street, right? You controlled everything about that. And in that context, it's kind of easy to understand how it might have been really scary to look at this world where you don't control all of that pipeline. You don't control all of that cabling, and it's effectively just the Wild West. Anybody could use the internet, and that must have been really, really jarring. But of course, fast forward today, we see this exact same sort of curve, the exponential curve of how things are adopted and democratized. And through that engagement with people, explodes, right? So it always starts kind of in the same way. It starts relatively small in adoption, but then as people get more access to it, as we start to see democratization, it explodes. And that's a big term for us in the Power Platform world, democratization. Does everyone remember the first time that you saw a smartphone, right? I remember the first time that I saw an iPhone. I was in sub-Saharan West Africa, which is probably not where you thought I was going to say I was. So if you don't know anything about my background, once upon a time in a previous life, I was a U.S. Marine. I'm a former Marine. One of the many jobs that I had when I was a Marine was as a Marine embassy guard, right? So you've seen all the movies. They always show us like in these, dress uniforms standing somewhere and, all that stuff. I don't say that to make myself look cool. The reality is more often than not, we're not there to look cool. We're there to make other people look cool, right? Like it's usually so that someone like Matt Damon can kick the crap out of us. There's a really good Jason Bourne movie where he burns through an entire Marine detachment in like 5 seconds. It's the worst recruiting poster we ever put together. But anyway, that's where I was, right? So I was on post at the embassy at Niamey Chair in Western Africa. A State Department employee had rotated in from DC and brought with him the first iPhone that I'd ever seen, right? And he was showing it off to us. He was demonstrating all the different things that went into it and showing it to the group. There were a couple of us standing around. Do you know what the first response was whenever he told us about it? That's dumb, right? Guess who said it? Yes, nailed it. Totally nailed it. So I like to think of myself as a relatively intelligent person, semi-forward thinking. I assume that's why Steve hired me. It's definitely not my looks. But whenever I was looking at the first smartphone, I didn't get it. I didn't understand, why would I use this? Why did I feel that way? Like, I don't know if all of us can kind of remember looking back, but remember the good old days where you could charge your phone like once a week? Like you didn't have to worry about like, oh my gosh, everywhere I go, I need to bring this charger, and the charger's proprietary. It doesn't connect to anything else. Now, in my defense, 15 years later, we're still figuring that one out, right? The whole connector on an iPhone thing. But regardless, beyond that, I just didn't understand it. For me, a phone was nothing more than a device I could walk around with. I could make phone calls on it, and I could send text messages at 10 cents a message. That's all it was to me. The idea of it being something where I could do computing or like low level grunt work, I didn't see that. If I wanted to use an expensive small device to pretend to be productive, I'd use my Palm Pilot like God intended. But what was really revolutionary about the iPhone, about the smartphone, was not the device itself. Does anyone know what it really was? It was the App Store. Right? It was the ability to change and extend that functionality of that device. That's what was really powerful. I mean, yes, it was an amazing feat of engineering in and of itself. I mean, the screen, what you could engage with, but ultimately it was the ability to democratize the extensibility of that. That's what was really explosive, because that meant that everybody, small developers, working by themselves, small companies or large companies could get involved in extending what that device could do. That was the really powerful part. And that's kind of an underlying theme in everything that we see in software development and in AI today. It's the adoption, the ability to engage with everybody so that they can extend that collectively. That's what really makes it explode. And of course, fast forward to today, this is kind of a good example because we've already talked about computers, but if you look, fast forward to today, smartphones have by and large overtaken computers in proliferation. I would be willing to bet you Steve's paycheck that every person here probably has a smartphone. That didn't get as many laughs as I thought it would.
And if you don't have a smartphone, just be quiet.
Right, but it's that democratization, right? That the ability to engage with these things in meaningful ways and extend them in something that makes sense for you. That's ultimately what leads to that proliferation.
Awesome. So, we thought it'd be fun to look back. Obviously, at that point in time, those are super smart people, right? But what was going on here? And we could boil that down to two things. One was context, right? At that point in time, for each one of those scenarios, it's really hard to grasp just how innovative those technologies were, right? Not only is it hard to grasp it, but it's hard to understand all of the different use cases it could be applied for. Because something new by itself without context doesn't really let you understand the full value and the full power of it. Number two is culture, right? It's not just the individual that has the new novel thing, but it's the culture that surrounds them that may lack the understanding of it. They may say, well, this is how we've always done things, right? Why would we ever want to change? And when you're in that kind of mindset, it's hard to fast forward to a different world where things could be more efficient. And not just a little bit more efficient, right? Exponentially efficient. We see those curves every single time. Now, while I was off on break, my little animations, I apologize about that. We look here at this part right here, right? When you're here and there's only 9 satellites orbiting the Earth, it's the context that's hard to understand. It's hard to understand how that's going to be leveraged in the future. Now, where I was going to get to is while I was on break, I had a little bit of free time. I did some reading, some things that I had queued up. It was this book right here, Courageous Cultures, that I thought was really interesting. I still buy physical books and I like to actually hold the paper and go and highlight and understand it. I'm still going through this, but I've almost finished it. They boiled down, if you want to build stronger cultures, there's 3 things that you should do to foster that. One are micro innovators. These are people that consistently look to make small improvements that have really large gains. When you see those curves, it's lots of little micro innovations that keep over time building to something that is a lot more substantial, a lot more powerful. It's also focusing on problem solvers. Micro innovators and problem solvers, they break it out a little bit differently, but problem solvers are people that they look at the business and the mission as if it were their own. And when they see something that's wrong, they are passionate to go and solve it. Conversely, if what people are doing in an organization is routine and mundane and boring, they lose energy to focus on micro innovation and problem solving. In comes automation, right? In comes large language model. We see potential growth with large language models and the way that you can infuse that in an organization, and specifically to foster these kinds of people in an organization to make big transformations. And of course, being a passionate customer advocate, or if you're in the federal space, right? Being an advocate of the taxpayer dollars, being an advocate of citizens, right? And thinking about that experience through their lens, not necessarily your lens. All right, pass it back over to Craig.
All right, so we can't talk about culture without talking about people, right? What is culture ultimately, if not an extension of your people and how they engage with one another? And as we are looking towards adoption of software in our organizations, we're probably going to run across some interesting characters. For example, we have Brian here. Brian works in accounting. Brian's a no guy, right? So Brian wants to make sure that whatever we're going to adopt, whatever we're putting value in, especially if you work in the federal government and we have accountability as to how we're spending taxpayer dollars, Brian wants to make sure that if we're adopting this, it's done in a controlled way, or I'm not going to have anything to do with it, right? Now, to be fair, when I was starting to set this up, I wanted this to be kind of like an anecdote of, the naysayers when we're adopting things. But the more that I engage with this fake angry cat Brian version of this anecdote that I'm telling, the more I kind of understood, to be fair, Brian's not wrong, right? Like if we're really thinking about how we want to invest our software dollars, we do need to make sure that we do so incrementally. We need to make sure that we're doing it safely. And then we need to make sure that there's value behind it. Don't just adopt it because it's new and cool, right? Especially in the federal government, we want to make sure there's value in what we're doing. So to be fair, Brian may have an awesome face on it, but he's not wrong, right? And the great thing about how we approach things in the Power Platform, and by extension in leveraging AI, is that we create this space where you can iterate on top of what you're doing. Now, when you looked at those exponential graphs of all the different powerful technologies we were talking about, yes, in future, they did end up being crazy explosive, widely adopted, used everywhere. But they also started small. They started somewhere, they started incrementally, and it was done so safely, hoping, in a way that you would adopt these things. And you see a lot of that in how you adopt the Power Platform, right? You have the default environment or your personal productivity environment. You probably renamed it whatever way makes sense for you. And this is where individual makers in the Power Platform can solve small scale problems, things that are specific to them, like a leave tracking app, or maybe it's just their team, small scale stuff. But there's probably data loss prevention policies that are around that environment that ensure they can't go out too far. They can't get in too much trouble. So in order to expand that, to introduce modularity in our overall solution space, we have extended environments where maybe we have a separate environment for human resources applications and the unique Dataverse instance that lives underneath it. It's bifurcated, it has role-based access, so that way that you ensure only those people are using those tools in a way that makes sense for them. And the same could be true for finance or any other use case you come up with. Now, the great thing about Copilots and adoption of the Power Platform is we're using this same design language. You'll see this as we're kind of going through our presentation. We did try and drop QR codes if you wanted to grab anything, but just know this at a very high level, the ability to engage Copilot functionality in your Power Platform environments is something that you can turn on and off by environment, right? So with that in mind, the Brians of the world can rest assured that we can adopt these things in a way that makes sense. We can use them if they work for us. And if they don't, we leave it off, right? We can introduce security around all of that and have the same environment strategy that we enjoy with the Power Platform, but applied to Copilots and AI. I'm going to pause a moment. I see a phone up. We good? Yeah. All right. Okay. Back over to Steve.
Awesome. Thank you. So what we want to do next was let's zoom out and think about high picture, right? So when we talk, you're gonna see all this in action, but we also wanted to show you kind of how does this work under the covers, right? So we've got Power Platform and Dynamics 365 over here, right? Those are Microsoft managed services we provide as SaaS. We also have Azure, and inside of Azure is Azure Open AI. That's like our own private instance of ChatGPT. Microsoft, we have a Microsoft managed subscription to Azure Open AI specifically for Power Platform and Dynamics 365. That is the service that we call. That's what kind of fuels Copilot. So all these demos you're going to see is what's happening under the covers is those services are talking to Azure Open AI. All of that communication stays inside of our data center. It's all encrypted. It's all secured. And as we've mentioned before, Azure Open AI, that is a stateless service. What does that mean? It doesn't know about previous prompts that you've asked it. It just literally takes input, spits it out, goes on to the next request. But what we've also done with Power Platform and Dynamics 365 is because this is a first-party Microsoft service, we have turned on what we call abuse monitoring on that service. And what that means is that we're doing responsible AI filtering over here before it gets to the service, and we also don't log or keep any of the telemetry data. By default, that data gets stored for 30 days. We, Microsoft, don't look in there unless something gets flagged and we go to investigate it. But for Power Platform and Dynamics 365, that data never gets stored in a log file. So really important to understand that. Same way that Microsoft 365 Copilot will work as well. And the reason that's done is so that all of your data stays within this boundary. Yes, it gets processed here, never gets stored there. Big distinction there. Okay, so for the folks that care about government, right? So that was, how does this work in commercial? I'm going to show you how this is going to work in what we call GCC, the Government Community Cloud. So it's a very similar model, except for the fact that in here in GCC, those services live in Azure for Government, so they live over here. You still have this same flow where there's some filtering of the request before it goes over to Azure Open AI. When this first rolls out, we do have commitment that by end of March, you will see some of this feature starting to light up. It's going to roll out in a way that we call opt-in, meaning that it's going to use Azure OpenAI in Azure Commercial. We will be transparent with people. If they want to do this, you can opt into this. By the way, this is also FedRAMP High over here. You're going from one FedRAMP High to another FedRAMP High system, but you can opt into this experience if you want to test that out. And as Craig mentioned, you can do this at the environment level, right? At a very small micro innovation level, you can do that. Phase 2 is going to be, we have public commitment that Azure OpenAI not only is going to be available in Azure Commercial, but also Azure for Government. When that is available, everything will work exactly the same, except in this case, Azure OpenAI now lives in Azure for Government. Same exact experience. We will also remove the opt-in option, right, to be clear about where data is going. You can still turn this on and off at the environment level, but that opt-in will go away. That is basically what we're looking at in terms of roadmap. Once again, end of March is when you will start seeing Copilot features lighting up. It may not be 100% of the Copilot features, but you will start to see that. And we're going to work faster to start getting more and more and more of that functionality into GCC. Pass it back over to Craig.
So all the things and innovative stuff we're talking about today, we still haven't gotten past the necessity of one remote. But beyond that, where are we in time, right? Why are we even having this conversation? I think in our keynote, we kind of keyed it up a little bit, and it's a great way to sort of think of this is, not just like branding, not just Microsoft marketing or any of that stuff. We're really seeing an inflection point where technology and adoption and consumption and technical minds are kind of coming together to create what we think is the era of Copilots. the era of AI, where we're going to be at that very beginning where people are starting to adopt things, but then from there it becomes this explosive growth. And when we look at the era of copilots, we don't use those words lightly. Like, we're very deliberate in how we term things. And if you've ever been in the Microsoft space and seen how often we change our icons and our naming branding, we are quite deliberate in how we name things. The era of copilots is really to capture the ethos that it is not intended to replace anything, right? The ability to engage with AI is not intended to replace developers, business analysts, or anyone, right? The idea is that AI can be your co-pilot, can be your wingman to figure out how you navigate these things. Have you ever needed to reach out to a large group of people and you needed to send them an email to kind of highlight, a summary of what you wanted to do, or maybe put a plan of attack as to how you're going to engage a problem? And you sit there in front of that blank email and you just can't figure out how to get started, right? On the reverse end of that, have you ever had someone from your team go ahead and do that for you, and then they get the draft in front of you and you edit that draft? It is significantly easier to refine a message than to generate one, right? So that's ultimately the area where we think that AI can really work together with you as a collaborator. It's to spark creativity. It's to help you whenever you're staring at that blank page so that you can then iterate on top of that. And the same is as true in text when you're doing an email as it is in software. If you don't know how to get started, Copilot can help you start moving in that direction, and then you iterate on top of it. And we believe that the best programming language is natural language. Now, we're very deliberate in that one too, because if you've ever traveled to a foreign country, I lived in Germany for many years. My wife is German, my kids are German. Well, they're dual nationals. But when I first got there, I, again, like to think of myself as a fairly intelligent person, but my own ability to speak German at the time meant that I had handcuffs on my creativity. The same kind of applies to our business processes. Have you ever, as a business analyst or someone who is not a developer, looked at a problem and thought, if it could just do this, but then you have to filter that idea through another developer who maybe doesn't see your same vision, right? Maybe they don't get it in the same way that you get it. That doesn't mean they're unintelligent. Obviously, they know what they're doing, but so do you. You know your business process better than they can, but you can't translate that into action because you're not a software developer. Using AI and using natural language as the best coding language eliminates that problem, but it also works for professional developers as well. Have you ever had a professional developer or a team of developers on your team where you needed to take on some sort of challenge, but maybe they're all .NET and you have to do this in Python, right? What do you do now? Like, you have to get wise in how that works. They'll figure it out. They're intelligent folks, but ultimately that's a drag on your velocity. That's a drag on your ability to solve that problem in a timely manner. Natural language AI eliminates that to where you can take a language that you understand, whether that be a common language like English or a common development language like Python, and translate that into a script that's going to be meaningful for you. And we believe approaching it that way, that's what aids the democratization of technology. It's putting everything on a spectrum where maybe you're on the left-hand side of this, maybe you're a power user, you can build really impressive formulas using DAX logic in Excel, or maybe you've built applications on top of Access. Hopefully you've deprecated those applications built on top of Access. But either way, this is where you started, right? Like, you're on this end of the technical spectrum. But you need to also be able to engage with your professional developers as well. Like, maybe you're comfortable doing .NET development purely on an Azure infrastructure. We can't leave those people out of our total solution. So it has to be this world where we can engage with everyone in meaningful ways. The Copilot experience is going to exist on the same spectrum. The ability to engage no matter where you're coming at this, no matter what your entry point is. Maybe you just want to use AI in the context of your M365 subscription, and it's only going to know the data that it has access specific to you, right? Or maybe you want to use low code to extend that, where you're introducing additional data connectivity and then it can iterate on top of that without having to use professional development. Or maybe you want to build your own Copilot writ large using a framework and an infrastructure that we put together for you in Azure AI Studio. But regardless of where you fall on this spectrum, the idea is that Microsoft can provide a safe framework backed by security and SLAs to help you do that. I did see a hand. I'm sorry. We'll take some questions here at the end. If you don't mind, just hold that for us. But we believe that we'll engage this. And the way that we'll see adoption is by engaging with people where they are, right? If you're a professional developer, you can be on the far end of the spectrum. We still have an answer for you. Okay, so we've done a lot of storytelling. We've done a lot of talking. I don't know that we would get away with this if we didn't do some level of demonstration. So let's get into those. And we're going to show a couple of different versions of this, a couple of different ways that AI can engage with the Power Platform and then extend things, right? Because it's the era of Copilots, not Copilot, right? It's the ability to engage no matter how you're using the solution. So the first one that I'm going to go over, this is going to be using Copilot in the context of Power Apps, building a Power App application, something that we're comfortable doing in low code and all that space, but using Copilot to achieve greater velocity in doing that. And I'm going to have to sit here on my laptop because I kind of have to see what's going on. So bear with me. But to get started, we're going to pretend that my name is Phil, except I have better hair. This is how we're going to start our building of an application. I'm just going to use a single line of text and say that I want to create an application for equipment checkout. So Copilot is able to take my instructions, my natural language comments, and then turn that into a data schema, right? So it's already generated a table. It started to populate it with columns that it believes will make sense for this. Equipment checkout ID, employee name, the type of equipment that I'm using. It's already gotten started for me. Now, in Copilot, I can use natural language to make updates. Like I want to add a new column. In this case, I want to add a column for checkout reason. So I'd use natural language to say that, and it automatically creates a column for them and populates it with sample data. Now, that being said, with sample data, what if I'm a developer and I need to test these things and make sure things are working, so I need more sample data? Well, there are entire industries built around this. If you've ever built something and you've used something like Mockaroo to download data sets so that you can prove that something works, with AI, I can just tell it to give me more sample data and it will pre-populate that for me. That may seem like a small thing, but if you've ever been tasked with doing these things, that's really a big time saver. I also had the ability to not just add new fields, but make updates to existing fields. Here's the equipment field being updated from text to dropdown. And again, this is another one of those examples where this may go completely, off the farm and you don't pay too much attention to it. But I guarantee you all across the software development spectrum, there is technical debt and deprecated columns that we've created, didn't quite fit the bill. And then it's like equipment.to deprecated, don't use exclamation point, right? But you can't really get rid of those things if you've ever built data relationships and there's some sort of dependency there. You're kind of stuck with it. Well, in this case, the data set the schema didn't match what I needed it to do, but because this application doesn't actually exist yet, I can tell AI through natural language to change that for me. That's eliminating future technical debt and making this significantly easier for me on the fly. All right, so now let's create our app, right? So the first thing that you're going to notice whenever this gets populated here is it's going to set up with a intelligent chat feature that provides contextual understanding on top of my data set. So I can ask the app specific information and it'll be smart enough to surface that information about my data set, right? So here I'm asking questions, what is the most popular equipment being checked out? And it gives me an answer purely based on the context of the data that I have there, right? It's telling me that the most popular equipment being checked out is a walkie-talkie, and this is when John checked one out, right? I ask a follow-on question. Who has overdue equipment? According to the data provided, Brian has overdue. Brian, I knew this is why he didn't. I knew there was an agenda going on here. But all it's doing is it's taking the data from that sample data set and then it's providing that context for us. It's not inventing information. It's purely looking in the context of what it already knows and surfacing that information for us. But it also is a functioning application as well, right? So I have a fully functional app. I can enter new checkout records. You can see that all of the controls here, like if I have data drop downs or the date picker, all of these things just inherently work, right? Completely out of the box, saving me a crazy amount of time. Now, my favorite part of this, of how this is all set up, is that completely out of the box, using Copilot to generate this app, it has made it responsively or in a responsive design sort of way, right? And if you don't know what responsive design is, that means that no matter how I scale this application, it's dynamically changing the app to make sure that it fits in my window. Why is this important? Well, if you want to use a Power Apps app on your mobile device, for example, previously you'd have to build two separate applications to make that work, right? With responsive design, you don't. Build the app once, in this case, just using natural language, and you can use the exact same application regardless of the medium that you're using to consume it. That could be on your laptop, on your desktop computer. It could be on your mobile device. It's inherently responsive. Now, anybody that's using low code can do this completely out of the box, but natural language did this by default, saving us so much time. So all that being said, I'm not going to step through what this looks like in Power Automate, but those same velocity impacts that you see in Power Apps and how I'm able to move faster. Look at all that we did there just using natural language relatively quickly. We're seeing a 60% higher success rate when building with Copilot. 80% faster building of apps over Excel files, right? But if you're comfortable in DAX language, that's naturally going to translate to Power FX. And the same velocity gains we're seeing in Power Automate as well. Twice as fast to create a Power Automate flow using natural language and Copilots to create that. And this 13 points NPS, think of this as a satisfaction score, right? So whenever new adopters are using Copilot to build Power Automate, we're already seeing this data in telemetry and commercial. It's showing us that they're significantly more satisfied with the end result and they're getting there faster, all purely based off telemetry.
Awesome, thank you. So this next one I want to show is going to be Dynamics 365 Customer Service with Copilot. Now, to set the stage and the context, we internally at Microsoft, our support team, we use Dynamics Customer Service for when people have technical issues. In this case, it's going to be about Azure. So customers call in, they're like, hey, I'm having an issue with my VNet. What do I need to do? This is an example of a customer service agent at Microsoft using Copilot to train off all the past support tickets that we've had at Microsoft to get answers faster for customers. All right, so here we go. We are the support agent at Microsoft. This is what looks like CRM. This is Dynamics Customer Service. I see that there's an incoming chat request, right? So the customer has been chatting with a bot. It's at a point where it's transferring to me, the live agent. I go ahead and accept that. And now this looks like CRM. There's 3 different windows here. That first one on the left is the actual chat that the customers had with the bot up until this point. In the middle there, this is all the information that we know, in this case, about Diane. So let's hold on one second. All the information we know about Diane, right? Like all the contact information, what has her history been with us at Microsoft and support. And now on the right is Copilot. What's really cool here is that we're not changing the workflow of a support agent, right? We're just augmenting it. We're adding additional capabilities. We're not fundamentally changing what they used to do. All right, so the chat is over there. What's going to happen now is that Copilot can look at the chat and suggest suggestions based off of the data that we know today. So this is more than just what we've trained off the public internet. It's public internet plus our own support ticket process, right? Oh, okay. Based off of this, let's get some more information on these specific things. I can put that into the response to the customer. Even cooler, there's a sources section down there. It's kind of hard to see, but check sources right there. What does that mean? Look at the actual past support tickets that look like this. If you want to dive into that, you can. That is also really important. We go ahead and put that back into the chat here. And of course, this is a little bit speed up, right? But we put it back into the chat. They come back with a correlation error code that they're actually seeing, because that was one of the suggestions that Copilot gave to us. And notice we're still in control here. To Craig's point, this isn't autopilot. It's Copilot, right? It's our wingman. Oh, based off of that, let's get these 3 specific things. And once again, it's because we've looked at all of the past support tickets and issues that we've had. We're learning off of that. So now when new support agents come in, they can get ramped up faster, right? It's all about speed. So we go back, and of course, in this case, now we've got a happy customer, right? I just wanted to show that as an example because I think that's a cool one where you think of classic CRM. Now we're infusing it with some really cool AI. And I think it's really amazing to see what you can get out of that.
All righty. Now, for this next one, if you take nothing else away from our presentation today, know that Steve and I were very diligent in making sure we got the right outcome, right? If you look in the Copilot space, there's a bunch of different icons that represent different technologies. This one, we are 100% sure, because we checked with marketing, is the icon for Copilot Studio. So we're quite proud of that.
And because I'm a nerd, that's an SVG, so you can scale it up or down and get the beautiful resolution no matter how big it is. So
these are the things that keep us up at night, folks. So making sure we had the right icon and that it was scalable, because we don't do pixelation in 2024. Okay, so I'm going to step through a couple different things, right? Now, what we're going to look at is Copilot Studio, which if you don't know it, it's based off of, consider it as like the artist formerly known as Power Virtual Agents, right? We've taken that technology that initially just started as a good idea in Azure with Azure Bot Framework, and we're going to iterate on top of that and subsume that functionality into Copilot Studio. and then start to make our copilots or our chatbots smarter using AI and Copilot functionality. So in this case, I'm going to ask a series of questions here directly to my Copilot in Teams, right where we work, right? So this is a good example of showing bringing that technology wherever you're going to engage with it. I'm going to ask the same question 3 times, and I'm going to get fundamentally different answers based off of how intelligent I've made that Copilot, and I'll step through what that process looks like. And while I'm doing so, I'll step through that spectrum we're talking about, starting with just the context of Microsoft 365, all of my Office entitlements. Then I'm going to extend that using configuration, like what you would see in a low-code environment. But then I'm going to really cross the Rubicon and go into professional development and use a custom connector built on an Azure framework and ask that same question. All right, so let's get started. So if I look here, what the user is going to do is I'm going to ask a question about a business problem that I'm working on. I want to ask Copilot, what are the lead times for supplier Alpine ski hats? But you can see the answer here, it's not quite what I'm looking for. It says that it cannot find the information that's relevant to me, and that's because out of the box, Copilot doesn't know information about my supply chain and the systems that I use to run my supply chain. But what's great about here is we have this extensibility story that I was talking about. And what I also love and want to stand still by is it did not know the answer, so it didn't fake it. That's important to know, right? I asked it a question that it did not have context on, so it did not pretend to. This makes this like the best coworker ever, right? Imagine how many times you have someone on your team who can very confidently give the wrong answer to a question that you've asked. In this case, Copilot, being responsible, has said, I'm sorry, I don't know. But let's fix that. Let's figure out a way to make sure that it does know. So if I look here, we can see that there's an option to use Microsoft Copilot Studio to create my own custom extensions. Think of these as like talents for Copilot. And I can point this at my own data sources. I can put my own logic into it. I can extend this. So if I click through, I'm going to load up Copilot Studio, and I'll see that there's a bunch of different options for how I can change that with different plugins, tasks. Think of these as talents, again, that I can introduce for Copilot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a conversational plugin. The conversational plugin allows me to chain together multiple steps like data lookups, text summarization, in order to provide a reply to that user in Teams. And I can use this conversational plugin directly inside Copilot. So let me go ahead and create this experience. Okay, so now what you can see is it's starting to step through the logic of how I would build this using triggers and actions. Now, if you're accustomed to using Power Automate or Azure Logic apps, this kind of design flow is going to look pretty similar to you, right? We like to keep things consistent. So now at this step, what I want to do is I want it to run in response to a question from an end user, and I'm going to take that and create what's called a generative answer. A generative answer allows me to go from existing knowledge, resources, and content that I specifically curate and choose and have it reply inside of Copilot. Now, that content that I curate and choose, that's important to know, right? It's only going to provide an answer based off of information that I pointed to. It's not going to make things up. We've already seen that if it doesn't know, it'll say it doesn't know. Okay, so if I look here at the trigger, we can see that it provides information about what the conversational plugin is going to do. And this is useful because it's registered back to the Copilot when I publish it, and it'll only invoke this extension in Copilot Studio when a user asks the relevant question. This conversational plugin is going to be used whenever an employee is asking questions about supplier metrics and performance. And this can be any other topic that you imagine. You just describe it using natural language. Go ahead and select that now. All righty. And if you see here over on the right, I can start to point this at specific data sources, right? I can provide generative answers on top of SharePoint sites, websites that I point it to, or I can really go so far as to add Azure Open AI services, and I can pull the information back to the user using that, backed by Azure AI Search. So I can extend these data sources in whatever way makes sense for me. So in my case, I just want to configure this to look at a SharePoint document where I'm going to put a PDF, and it's going to sit there, and that's going to be the context of how I answer this question. So to do that, I'm going to create a link, and I've loaded it in here, contoso.sharepoints, and that's going to be where I put my information that I'm going to get information from, where I put my document I get information from. And you can see here, I have a 20-page document that I'm linking to, this PDF. That's what lives at that SharePoint site, and this is what's going to provide the context for how I answer these questions, right? So again, it's not going out to the interwebs. It's not making things up. It's purely going to answer with data pulled just from this document. So now that I've done that and I've configured that, I need to pass this information somehow. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to set the string up to where it's pulling in just the text, and that's going to be how it answers. And now when I go back, let me bring up Teams. I'm going to ask the exact same question. What are the lead times with supplier Alpine Ski House? Now this time it's answered, on average, supplier Alpine Ski House delivers products within 10 days of order placement. It was able to answer that question because it found the information in the PDF that I pointed it to. All right, so that's cool, but that's not enough. Ultimately, this is just a static document, right? It just lives somewhere in SharePoint. Probably no one's updating that, or if they are updating it, it's not on a super frequent schedule, right? So let's see what else we can do here. So now that I've published this topic to Copilot, I can go back and I can extend this experience using a different generative answer, right? Because I've already set this up. I already have some logic as to how I'm coming at this. So now this time, I'm going to create a new conversational plugin. Going through the same steps I was talking about earlier, generative answers, all that stuff. But this time, I'm going to configure it to trigger whenever an employee asks supplier metrics that go beyond the context I've already given. This time, I want to call an action to my SAP system. We can see here that I can choose an action to call it to SAP. I can authenticate and then execute that those data queries pulling straight from my SAP backend. Because the reality is my information is not always going to be on a website. It's not always going to be in Microsoft. Sometimes I have to play well with others. Sometimes my information is going to be in SAP or another business system. So just like the same connector story that we have across the entire Power Platform, where you can extend this with data connectivity purely out of the box, you can do the same thing here. That same design language works here. So now I want to choose to read that SAP information and resolve the connection, and then pull that, and it can work whether it's on premises or in the cloud, however I want to connect to that data. And then I just do a simple configuration to select the table command, and that's what I want to use to execute and read from our supplier history, that data table, and then use that context whenever someone asks a question. Okay, but that's not enough. Let's take this all the way to the other end. Let's look at this from a professional developer standpoint. Let's say I also want to take the information from earlier and use it to make another call to another system. And to do that, I've registered a custom connector in Azure API Services. Now, this is a RESTful API that I've already published. Right? You can use GitHub, Visual Studio, build these custom connectors however you'd want to, and easily expose those APIs for many of those backed by the same security and framework that you benefit from in Azure, and then just call it like you would any other connection. I can just invoke that custom connector to look up real-time information about supplier quality metrics. This is chained after that SAP call. So when I execute this step, basically in response to the message from the user, in Copilot, I'm calling SAP, and then I'm making a call to an internal system. But I don't just want to return this raw data. I actually want to generate a synthesized response across two separate systems, right? Which is crazy if you really think about it. It's making a call to one document in one system. It's making a call to another SAP in this custom connector that I've set up. And then when it gets that information, it's reading both, and then it's summarizing the information between the two of them. That's bonkers. So I just pass that information from the supplier quality metrics, and then I create a summary based off that information so that I can reply that back to the user. And what's great is you can see I'm giving instructions, right? These are prompts that I'm providing to the generative AI model in addition to the information from the supplier quality metrics API to generate the response, right? I'm telling it, create a summary for lead times, et cetera, right? I'm introducing natural language talk as it's providing this response. Now that I've configured that, I'm just going to go up here and publish. Alrighty. Publishing, saving, and we're good. Okay, so now I'm going to go back and I'm going to ask this same question again. What are the lead times with supplier Alpine Ski House? Now you can see in the answer that it's going to give me, it's providing an incredible amount of information. It's telling me the Alpine Ski House delivers products within 10 days of order placement. And over the past 6 months, they've maintained an on-time delivery rate of 86% for all of our orders. So you can see, again, using that spectrum, as I've asked the exact same question multiple times, it's getting progressively smarter because I pointed it at new data sources and I've told it how to iteratively answer that based off of the same question. This is not from a public website. It's not available inside Microsoft 365's cloud boundary. This is information that is not available in the foundational model itself. So what I've had to do is build these integrations using Copilot and make it progressively smarter. But again, it's not going to give me an answer that it doesn't know. So if it doesn't have the context, it'll say it doesn't know. But if it does have access to additional information through any of these data connectivity pieces, I can progressively make it smarter. And it is only going to provide me an answer. It's not going to make up facts. It's only going to answer based off of what it can read. I can see your hand. We'll have questions here at the end if you don't mind. And all this comes together as a seamless end-to-end experience. So again, this is that spectrum that we were talking about, right? Regardless of how you approach this technology, whether you're just using it in the context of Office, or you want to extend using low code, or you're a professional developer that can extend this using custom connectors backed by Azure SLAs and frameworks, you can 100% leverage this same technology to make your copilots progressively smarter.
Right. So to wrap up, I know we just covered a lot of ground there. I want to go back to that demo. It's pretty amazing and mind-blowing to me that we went from no code inside of Teams. We went to low code in Power Platform, Copilot Studio. We went to pro code, right? All the way to Azure. All of that was integrated together into one experience. And then when you look at the progressive, just how much better those responses get, it's pretty amazing to see that in action. And even cooler, all inside of one cloud, end to end. It's really, really amazing to see that. So our call to action here is, first off, just thank you all so much for coming out today, especially braving the elements. Okay, thank you for the energy. Thank you for everybody that was on the call here. We would definitely urge you all to start testing with Copilot today, whether that's no code, whether that's low code, whether that's pro code, and know that it isn't just well-defined and only stuck in one guardrail, right? You can go across that spectrum that Craig was talking about and integrate really, really well. We also know that security is paramount. We hope that we did a good job being clear about the architecture and the security of how these things are working together, but hold us accountable to that. If you have questions or feel like something wasn't quite explained well enough, let us know, because we really want to make sure we nail that one down. Lastly, we talked about the Courageous Cultures book and the need for context, right? Think about how this could be used in the context of whatever the organization is that you support today, whatever the challenges that you face today, right? And really lean into that. And I think you'll be amazed at the kinds of problems that you can solve with this. And think about that curve, right? I think we're just at the beginning of that hockey stick. And I think it's going to be so exciting to see where this is going to go, right? And how people could apply these things in the future.